Welcome to GNCC's Espresso podcast, where we dive into timely and impactful topics shaping our economy and community. My name is Mishka Balsom, and I will be your moderator for today. We are exploring a critical issue, the potential threat of US tariffs and the impact on Canadian businesses and on our local economies. With so many livelihoods depending on a stable trade relationship with the United States, it's crucial to understand how these tariffs could disrupt industries and challenge business operations. We will be tackling key questions, including which municipalities and sectors are most vulnerable to these tariffs? How can businesses prepare and adapt to these changes? What role will retaliatory tariffs play, and what impact could they have? And what are the broader implications for the Canadian economy? Today's format is like this. We encourage you to engage with us by sharing your questions and comments in the chat. We really would like to have a dialogue on this important topic. This session is recorded and made available to you right afterwards. And if you wish to enable live transcript, you can find that option on your Zoom screen. If you run into any technical difficulties, please utilize the chat function or email us directly and we will get back to you immediately. But before we move to our expert discussion, we are pleased to announce that today's Espresso is powered by Niagara Economic Development, whose mandate is to promote Niagara on a global scale and to work in partnership with the region's 12 municipalities to provide effective and innovative solutions. Joining us today to provide his expert insights is Blake Landry, Manager of Economic Research and Analysis for the Niagara Region's Economic Development Department. Blake is a trusted voice in economic data and a very familiar name when it comes to understanding regional trends and challenges. And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to you, Blake.
Morning, and thank you, Mishka, for having me. Niagara Economic Development's core mandate is to attract investment with a strategic focus on key sectors such as manufacturing and agribusiness, as well as emerging sectors such as electric vehicle mobility, marine, and healthcare. Niagara Economic Development is also tasked with marketing and branding Niagara globally as an ideal location for strategic investment. 2024 was a highly successful year. Niagara Economic Development facilitated over $1.6 billion in new investment, with 12 new business expansions, creating over 590 new jobs in the immediate term. We are now focused on the aftercare stage of these investments to ensure they are successful. Looking ahead to 2025, we face some new challenges given the geopolitical context. However, our investment pipeline remains strong, and we continue to manage new investment inquiries in our key and emerging sectors. We would like to thank the Greater Niagara Chamber of Commerce, Stephen Tapp, and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce for this important discussion on trade relations between Canada and our partners and its impact on the business sector. Thank you very much.
Blake, thank you so very much. Thank you so very much for being the power not only behind this Espresso, but for all that you do for the region that has really a direct impact on so many businesses and on so many individuals. So thank you for all of that. And so my thanks go to you and your team. And now over to our distinguished guest. We are honored to have Dr. Stephen Tapp, Chief Economist and Senior VP of Research, Data and Analytics at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce with us today. He has a master's and PhD in economics from Queen's University. And Stephen brings extensive expertise in economic analytics and analysis and strategic insights into Canada's business landscape. Stephen, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. And as you mentioned at the outset, this is a very busy time for businesses, but very important in terms of trying to understand the analysis and the data that can help businesses as well.
Thank you. We received from all of our participants a number of questions already in advance. And when we looked at some of the questions, we kind of thought we can actually group them into 5 categories. And so some of you had questions around the impact of US tariffs on Canadian and local industries. Others looked for solutions and ideas about how business can adapt and strategic responses to what is happening. Others, again, looked at trade and market diversification. What are some other opportunities and the broader economic policy implications? And then again, some questions really linger around the question of what is the long-term trade outlook and consumer behavior that we can anticipate. So those are really the categories of questions that have come forward. But again, as I mentioned in my opening comments, please utilize the chat function if you're here in attendance, and we will get to all the questions that come forward. But just to set the tone and the basis and foundation for this discussion, Stephen, I have a question for you. According to some sources, economic uncertainty has surged by 30% since the potential tariffs were announced. And the question often that we have when we are meeting with businesses, do you see the current economic climate as the calm before the storm or the storm before the calm?
It's been a storm, I would say. Definitely not seeing a lot of calm in the media and in terms of overall understanding of what's happening right now. Just generally because Donald Trump is undertaking a strategy of flooding the zone, as I think Steve Bannon characterized it, where you're seeing executive orders and the use of the power of the presidency to really, you talk about elevated policy uncertainty. The measures that we have both for U.S. trade policy, but also for Canadian general policy uncertainty with our own political uncertainty happening as well. I would say it's probably one of the most difficult times for companies to navigate. And we mentioned before, even in the pre-discussion, the COVID period, we've had, a global financial crisis and other things, but it does seem like in terms of the overall level of uncertainty, this is a new level and exceeds even what we had in Trump 1.0 in the first term, where there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of threats. Tariffs did come in place on steel, aluminum, and there were tariffs threatened on autos and threatened to withdraw from NAFTA. So we're seeing that now, but we're seeing that happening in many dimensions. And I think it's exhausting to think that this has only been really, the first month of presidency, but it feels like it's been a long time for now. And I would say the mood of businesses, we're actually getting data in today from our Canadian Survey of Business Conditions. So it just came in a couple hours ago. I haven't had a chance to go through the results, but our team will be doing that. The last survey that we had business sentiment essentially waning a little bit and people concerned. I do expect to see the numbers of today's survey in this current quarter, in the first quarter for 2025, to be even worse. But I think that there are things to hold on to and reasons not to despair, and hopefully we can get into some of those throughout the discussion as well, because I think it's not just bad news, but it's certainly a lot of news and people kind of feeling like they're on this treadmill and getting hit all over the place right now. So.
I can say that when I look at the Niagara region here, this level of, and the way to define it, the conversations that we have, that we look at, as I think many of our businesses are, and would say it's a very uncertain time for them. So that's how they are looking at it. And it's really interesting how over the last 4 to 6 weeks, it has changed. Initially, we heard the uncertainty from certain sectors, especially those depending on the export sector. And now it seems to have shifted into nearly every sector has this level of uncertainty. So it's been interesting. Also, before we get into those categories that are outlined, what are some of the most imminent timelines we should be aware of regarding these potential US tariffs? Just to set again the foundation for it, just so that people have a sense of what to expect in the upcoming weeks and maybe days to look for.
Yeah, it's almost one of these things where we should say that we should expect the unexpected, because there are Trump is setting expectations and Trump is setting timelines. As Trump came into power on January 20th, there were some different executive orders, and the expectation was among a lot of folks, because Trump had set that expectation back in November, that the tariff rate would be 25%, essentially across the board for Canadian exports to the US, with the exception of energy, which would have a slightly lower rate of 10%. So that was the sort of initial foray. This has changed over time with some additional actions on China that have just been taken recently, focusing more on steel and aluminum. And the expectation and timelines on those, from my understanding now, is it's expected on March 12th that the steel aluminum tariffs will come in. They're being used under a different Section 232 legal framework that he actually had imposed in the Trump first term. And so I would say the likelihood of those tariffs coming in place is higher. Not to say that we don't expect tariffs, but the other parts that we have seen changing on a daily or hourly or weekly basis has been an initial tariff volley and then a 30-day reprieve. And that 30-day pause is supposed to come up on March 4th in next week. And the expectations are that there would be tariffs coming into place early March. Having said that, Trump was trying to use international emergency, what was so-called IEPA, ways based on the arguments that fentanyl and other migrant crisis and things that was an emergency and that would allow him to bring these broad-based powers in place. As that was the initial volley, it then became an executive order to look in more detail at trade deficits and look at unfair trade practices. And so I think the broader game that's happening is more likely an April timeline, where reports are brought back from the Department of Commerce and some other US trade representative discussions. And in that case, I think Trump would have a stronger legal grounding, or at least backing, for bringing broader based tariffs in. So I think there's multiple tracks that have emerged, but people are concerned that there could be large tariffs coming in place on Canada in the first week of March. People in the steel aluminum sector obviously are quite concerned because they've lived through this before the first term. And there are other policy descriptions that would stack tariffs up on top of tariffs. And it's almost anybody's guess in terms of how that would play out. There is no precedent really for the world that we're in, other than to say we've been through this in Trump's first term, and this is that, but I think on steroids.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of describing it. I wanted to also just thank our participants, because it's really nice, because comments are coming in through the chat function and directed at this conversation here of people wanting to engage. And on the question of timelines, thank you for outlining what we can expect, or who knows what we can expect in March and April, but what it looks like as of this moment and today. But one of the questions that has come forward is, how quickly could Canadian businesses start feeling the impact of this situation? And I think that is a really interesting one, because there's a little bit the sentiment, yes, it's going to take place, but then maybe it's going to be taken off the table and maybe we won't feel it. But in looking at it, one of our participants is asking how quickly business can start feeling the impact of the tariffs.
So the way I like to think about that is kind of separate things out from, there is an uncertainty shock that is in place that the Canadian economy is feeling right now, and people are reacting, and financial markets have priced in some of this. So I think that there was a reasonable chance that Trump was going to be elected, and people knew that. But then when Trump came out in November and really started going full force on, he was the tariff man, and we knew that he was likely to use or threaten tariffs. The threat of tariffs and the moving and changing threat of tariffs itself is this uncertainty shock I talked about. And the most obvious reaction to that has been increased volatility in financial markets to some extent, and a general depreciation of the Canadian currency. So as Trump was sort of coming or about to come in or won office in the fall, Canadian dollar, I think, was sitting around 73 cents or so. We've lost 5 or 6% roughly in the Canadian dollar relative to the US dollar. Part of that is because just the US dollar safe haven and strength, and people thinking, all right, if there's going to be uncertainty, I would rather be kind of on the US side of the border. So we have seen changes in overall international prices as a result of uncertainty. And then the uncertainty shock itself has also required people to reassess their business models and their investments. And we don't have a lot of great data on investment in real time, but national accounts and other data comes out with a bit of a lag. We expect that there'll be a postponement. So not necessarily people not investing or not investing, at all, but a much less desire to take large scale investments right now, just given this uncertainty of if your business model, if you're in Niagara and your business model is predicated upon smooth and roughly tariff-free access to the US market, and you're looking to expand your factory or locations and that, I think people are re-advising and thinking about those things. And in most cases, the initial reaction is to pause and to delay and say, okay, well, until we have more information on the situation, maybe now is not the time to get the bank loan for X million dollars. Maybe we can do that once we have some certainty with what we're dealing with. So the first part of the answer is on the uncertainty shock itself. And then the second part, I think if you want to talk more, we can talk about what would be the potential impacts of the tariffs. if and when they're imposed, I think that's its own kind of discussion as well.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting. Your comments have actually mirrored some of the conversation we've had with financial institutions here. And what they have noticed is that those institutions are talking to their clients, the ones who wanted to invest, actually holding off, and a lot of them are actually paying down their debt. So they have really observed that as being one of the trends that has been noticeable. And so it's interesting to hear. I want to be a little bit more specific. So looking at the impact of US tariffs on our local industries and the Canadian one overall. When I look at the situation through the Niagara lens, we have a bit over or around 550 businesses who are exporting about $6 billion of goods to the US annually. The US market accounts for 72% of our total exports. And when I look at it from a labor perspective, we have about 12% of our workforce who is employed and directly linked to that. That's not looking at the importing aspect of it. Could you give us a sense of what are the most significant US tariff threats that could affect industries and how they could impact businesses? And when I look at it specifically through the Southwestern Ontario and Niagara lens of it, I look at certain industries as well that especially linked to automotive and other areas of it. But if you can give us a little bit of a sense on that one, it would really assist us all.
Yeah, so I will direct people, and maybe I can put this in the chat if I have a second after, or we can put this in addition to the YouTube links or others. We have a Canada-US trade tracker, which we have put together at the Canadian Chamber, and that allows you to drill down initially at the national level, but then the provincial level for the Canadian side, the US level on the state side, and that would tell you what some of the main products are that are being traded, what the volumes are, and then who the main trading partners are. I just released a blog in the last few weeks, which tried to drill down beyond the provincial data to more local and city level, CMA level data for Canada. And we have data now on our website for 41 different cities, because in Canada, if you have a population over 100,000, you're in this census metropolitan area designation. And so St. Catharines and Niagara is a large one. And we were able to do some analysis there, similar to some of the numbers that you cited in the question, of how much does the local economy trade as a share of its overall GDP, so we can get a sense of that. And then the second thing that we looked at, in addition to just sort of looking at the numbers to understand, was what percentage of the overall export basket from a local region is going to the United States. So how much do you trade in terms of your intensity, and how dependent are you on the US? I can speak kind of directly to what the results we have at a high level, and then also what we drilled down for St. Catharines and Niagara. Our estimates are that St. Catharines and Niagara, of the 41 cities, falls in 16th rank of the overall. So it is in the area which is more exposed than the national average, given the fact that based on our latest numbers, about a quarter of GDP, the local economy, is based on exports to the US. So that ranks pretty high. That's in ninth out of 41 cities. So St. Catharines Niagara is the whole greater Niagara region is quite trade intensive. And if you add on to that there are about a quarter of exports are going beyond the US market, but the 3/4 are going to the US market. And of course, that's the area where we should expect that there may be some potential other broad-based tariffs or narrower tariffs on sectors. And so that would definitely have an impact on that. So I would say at a high level, we are seeing more trade exposure among the overall kind of 401 corridor in and around St. Catharines, Niagara, Hamilton, people that are involved in manufacturing equipment in the auto sector, tied to the trade to the United States. That's been long the story. I grew up in London, Ontario, and I can obviously remember all the trucks driving through the 401, and been to Guelph and Mississauga more recently, and of course know how much a lot of business depends upon the US market. So I think people are rightly concerned about the potential for tariffs, but I would come back to what I said before in terms of there's the threat of the tariffs and there's the impact of the tariffs themselves. As of the current recording right now at the end of February, there are no new tariffs that have been brought in place that are impacting the economy, but there's certainly that threat hanging over that there could be tariffs. And so I think that's, at least if I try to situate Greater Niagara, it's more exposed given its trade exposure than the rest of Canada. And there's lots of industries that you know that cross the border frequently in terms of their production processes and their inputs and their sales. So it's something that, obviously the point of this discussion is it's something that's a big concern for companies who are operating right now in that region.
Thank you. And thank you very much for making also the distinction between the tariff announcement versus tariffs that are in place and really understanding what we're talking about. I also wanted to make all of our participants aware that in the chat, we actually shared the link to the trade tracker that Stephen had mentioned. It's on our website where you can find it, and it might be really giving you the information that you're looking for. But related, Stephen, to what we were just talking about was one of the questions that has come forward, and it says, with ongoing shifts in trade relations, how do you anticipate these changes will impact labor markets in Canada, particularly in industries that rely on international trade? You looked and positioned how Niagara fits into it and where we fit on the scale of municipalities. But give us a sense of labor market impact.
Okay, so you're looking for, I just put a link in the chat there as well to the cities, and I think I might have sent it to you, but we can broaden that out more. So the impact on labor markets, I think, again, we got to think about what is the shock that's hitting local economies, and what are their industrial compositions, and then what are the mechanisms and policy tools that could be used to offset some of these shocks. I think on the monetary policy, if you sort of just think macro policy in Canada, on the monetary policy side, the Bank of Canada has recently released its monetary policy report, and they went through a very detailed analysis of the potential impacts of the tariffs. They do have a pretty negative situation in terms of the modeling that we've done. If the tariffs are applied in a broad base across the vast majority of exports, and if they remain in place for a long period of time, both of these are big ifs. If that's the case, our best estimate, the bank's estimate, most other private sector economists would suggest that would result in a recession at a national level in Canada. It would be in the neighborhood of a recession that we have felt in, let's say, the 80s or the 90s, and in a typical recession. In, of course, the pandemic, we had a much bigger drop off and then a sharp comeback. So, but I don't see the impacts being immediate. We haven't seen in the data that we're looking at yet any job loss associated with it. I'd say that nobody's lost their job in the last little while, but it's hard to, at this point in time, given where we're at in the cycle, to pinpoint that back down to tariff threats. And if anything, Canada's labor market, I think, has been performing better than most people expected in the last 3 or 4 months. There's been a bit of a hiring binge, which people didn't expect. The labor market unemployment rate has started to turn down as opposed to up. And the government has restricted, to some extent, immigration numbers, which had increased quite significantly the last few years. That's slowing down. So we're seeing the population slow down. But the labor market at a national level is more broadly balanced now than it was, if you can remember, back in let's say 2022, if you were attempting to hire people, both the wages that were being expected and then accommodations in terms of work from home or other things, there was a lot more power on the side of workers at that point in time. And now I think it has been easier for people to hire to some extent. It's still difficult in certain sectors, but the labor market, notwithstanding some of the wage pressures, is a bit more balanced. So I think taking that as the starting point, if your question is what would the potential impacts be on the labor market, I think we'd look to probably the Bank of Canada to reduce interest rates to try to offset some of these things. That would reduce the cost of borrowing, that would encourage spending, and that would hopefully reduce some of that initial shock. There would also be likely fiscal policy responses. The government has talked about trade policy responses and retaliation. We talked about that as well. But you could expect that there would be either geographic, let's say through the employment insurance system is one, where if people have lost their jobs and have worked a certain amount of hours, you could expect that there would be loosening up of the eligibility requirements or an increasing in the payouts of some of those systems, which would be more targeted to areas that are going to be hit harder. Because as we look at our analysis, we can see that this is not a uniform shock that's hitting the country in all the same ways. It's much different in southwestern Ontario than it is for places that are located at the coasts of the country that may be trading more with Europe or trading more with Asia, and maybe trading less with the US, or maybe not very trade dependent at all. I was in Victoria Chamber of Commerce in the last week or so, and that's an area where I actually don't think that they're particularly exposed. Not, not that things would be great, but there could be some upside to that economy in the sense that the exchange rate will likely depreciate further. And we're seeing a lot of, well, we could see more Americans traveling. So even in Niagara region, you could imagine that as the dollar goes to 65 cents and Americans are aware of what they can buy when they cross over the border in terms of, entertainment and accommodation, other things, you could get more American tourists. And for a tourist-based region like Niagara too as well, you could also get Canadians who have decided for whatever reason they don't want to travel to the United States because they're upset about this. And we've seen a buy Canadian sentiment, and we'll probably see a more of a local travel phenomenon. So you'll probably get more Canadian tourists. And that's similar to what happened back early in the first couple of years of the pandemic, where people either just literally couldn't travel across borders, or thought for whatever reason they would be drivable, or they would just kind of stay in Canada. So I think you're seeing some of those things happening for local regions as well right now. So that's just kind of at a high level some of the labor market impacts that I think people are seeing right now, and that might happen go forward.
Thank you so very much. And I can see how it is. We will have to wait and see in many of those cases to see the exact impact. But you're absolutely right. Niagara, one of our key sectors, in addition to manufacturing and agri-food and agriculture, is also naturally the tourism aspect of it. And we have identified the same opportunities there because of a low Canadian dollar, close to the border, and the opportunities of attracting actually more visitors to our area. But I wanted to, just before we move on to another topic, you brought up the issue of retaliation. And there have been many conversations where we hear often from people being almost a bit hesitant of Canada's reaction towards the tariffs that are there, because they could have an even deeper economic impact, negative impact on Canadian businesses, on Canadians themselves. Do you have a sense from, or is there any data that supports that US tariffs on the one side have this impact on our economy, but retaliatory tariffs have an even deeper impact on us?
Yeah, so I think that's a bit of a tricky, I mean, it's a tricky question in the sense that the reason that Canada would respond, I think Trump is clearly acting as a bully in this situation. And if you think back to sort of a schoolyard situation where somebody is, bullying somebody, at some point they're threatening to beat you up. Like, I mean, Trump has been threatening to beat Canada up for the last few months. There's a school of thought that fighting back and having a strong defense and showing that you're not weak, it's particularly around a president like Donald Trump, is important. So I think some people feel like the strategic response would be, and the government has had a list of 2 different rounds of retaliations, which would initially start more surgical and then eventually kind of grow over time. If what that does is apply pressure to local regions in the United States and people lobby their state capitals or Washington, and if Canada is able to, it would inflict additional costs. It would thicken the border. It would raise costs for importers. It would make things more difficult. But the strategic objective of that is to bear that for a short period of time in order to remove the tariff threat entirely. So there is a sort of a cost benefit analysis. If people view that Trump is putting the tariffs in place essentially for his entire term and they're not coming off for whatever reason, then retaliating with tariffs of our own in that environment would not make a lot of sense because it would increase our costs of imports. But for other folks who say, well, if Trump shows that he's pushing forward against us and we don't come back with anything, then he'll continue to bully us and he'll continue to ask for more concessions. So I think it's a tricky part. It's not obvious from there's sort of the game theory perspective and there's the trade policy perspective. I think for trade policy economists, generally they would prefer there to be less frictions at the border and larger markets. But where that discussion has turned in Canada has been more to look domestically and look internally and to say, okay, I don't really know what Donald Trump is going to do in the next week. He may bring tariffs on, he may not bring tariffs on, but it should be easier to trade between Ontario and Quebec, and it should be able to trade internally. Can we reduce internal trade barriers as a way to sort of try to offset some of these challenges that we expect are going to be happening internationally? I think that's where the conversation has gone from retaliation in a narrow sense of trade policy more to, can we look inside the Canadian economy and make ourselves more dynamic and more resilient And what are the ways that we can do that?
And Stephen, that has been something we have advocated for from a chamber's perspective, because we're also really known to being in a wine region. So that has been always a challenge for that sector alone, and it could represent an opportunity. Over the last couple of weeks, where we have heard businesses have moved some of the supply south of the border from here. Others who are purchasing regularly from the United States have purchased already more than what they normally would in this given period of time. And one of our attendees and participants here today is asking, are there any estimates on how much investment has been diverted to the US away from Canada due to the imminent threat of tariffs? And this is what we hear too, because there's often the question, will businesses relocate in the US? Will they expand? And not actually grow here, where they maybe had seen it as being an opportunity about a year ago.
Yes, no, I see that question from Dennis in the chat there too. Let me first, before I get to the investment part, let me first say that we have done analysis back of the impacts of the tariffs on steel aluminum in Trump's first term, and that was a point in time where we did see the same type of dynamics that we saw there. I believe we're seeing now, and that is what people have called either front running the tariffs or essentially trying to stockpile and move things across the border. I anticipate that we would see this in Canadian trade data, which is a little bit slow to come out, mind you, but for the month of December, and we're getting into data now, we'll soon have data for December and January, when the tariff threats were really in place. There's definitely a lot of anecdotal evidence from the businesses that we talk to that if you're an American importer and you're getting things from Canada, if you think that there's a possibility that there could be a 25% increase on the cost of that transaction, if you have capacity to store these goods and use these goods and build your inventories, I do think that one adjustment mechanism is the inventory building. And so we saw that very clearly in the steel aluminum products itself prior to that tariff coming in. And I think at a national level right now, I do think that freight forwarders and logistics folks have told me that they're quite busy, and a lot of people have asked about this. So I would assume that as we get more data, we will see Canadian trade both at the very end of 2024 and in the early period of 2025 that we're in now, will probably do a lot better than most people would have thought, given a trade war, because there is this urgency. So I think that's on the inventory building part. And as Trump continues to move out this threat from now to 30 days to maybe 30 days from there, that may wane to some extent, but I think that impulse is still there for people. The other part of the question is a bigger question on foreign direct investment. Or another way to get around, one way to get around tariffs is to make the trade. If you need to just buy one thing in 2025, you'd buy it now and you wouldn't buy it later. And that's it's a sort of very simple example. Another way that Canadian companies or others that they're part of multinationals, or if they have multiple production facilities, if you're not trading across the border and exposing a tariff, if you're producing inside the US border, and this is, of course, Trump's big gambit, he wants to sort of bring people in, and he says, if you make inside the US, if you're inside the US, you don't pay the tariff. And so I think there's not a lot deeper than that. I think he's trying to cajole people to move. If you're on the Niagara side, yes, well, move to Buffalo or move to the other side. And I would say we know that companies are thinking about this. I don't have any access to data that would validate that that's happening at a large level. And if I look back through what happened the first term, again, we had if you look at the end of it, I don't think you saw this mass exodus of Canadian companies going to the US. But as you lived through it, it did feel like every day somebody was saying, this manufacturer, that manufacturer is considering these strategies. Sometimes people underestimate the persistence and the rationale of things like in the first place. It's not as though people necessarily sit down and think from first principles as a greenfield investment. I'm going to set something up on Niagara. We're going to set something up in Rochester. Often they inherit a business, or they're somewhere and they're working, and you have these very long persistent supply chains that have been built up in ways that make sense because the business and the economics are such that it makes sense for a company to specialize in a small sliver of the overall chain, and then they can sell at lower costs and more competitive. And so it's not obvious to me that the Trump tariff threats change economics and change business. They do increase the hurdle rate now for your investment. If you're trying to make an investment now, you probably need to have a much more viable investment than you need to have a few months ago. But the underlying business case and the underlying economics are not necessarily fully changed, unless you're in a state of the world where the US is just going to put itself in a tariff wall for the indefinite future. And in that case, I think, yes, people are scenario planning. They're looking through, is it possible that my company is less competitive in that state of the world? And what can I do? Well, you can source local. If instead you were buying an American input and you bought that input from somewhere else in Ontario, you're not going to pay the tariff. So I think people are looking around at their overall operations and figuring out, who would pay an overage and who would pay the charge if this tariff comes in place, and kind of renewing their contracts or reviewing their contracts. But the short answer to the question is I don't think we've seen a big upsurge in the number of companies that have moved to the United States. But I think there's a lot of people that are thinking about those movements. But I think if we try to move forward to the end of the year or move later and there's slightly more clarity, or the Trump threat has been threatened several times and hasn't happened, I think people would be more secure in the sense that they have a stronger basis for the plans that they're making.
I think, Stephen, you're making an excellent point, because we even hear not only from the private sector, but also from the public sector at a municipal, regional level, at a provincial level, that even some of the contracts there are being considered to be given now to Canadian ones, not only based on lower costs, but the sense of who do we need to support in this uncertain times. A lot of questions have come forward, because when we look at it, Canada is made up of 95% small to medium-sized businesses, employing a significant number of people. And how can they adapt to this trade uncertainty? And a lot of them are asking for real, almost practical terms, and to a sense to saying, how can we build resilience within our own operation while these persisting uncertainties are in place?
So these are hard questions. I've thought through whether there is a disproportionate burden on smaller traders and smaller businesses. I think it's probably that seems to be the case. If you think about a lot of larger businesses, we do know from the value of trade that roughly half of the trade between Canada and the US on the good side that takes place is through, quote, related parties. So it might be, let's say, General Motors trading with itself and subsidiaries of itself. I think if you're part of a very large multinational operation, you do have options that smaller, if you're, have 5 people that are working out of a small shop that are located on one side of the border and you only have one production facility, that's a very different state of affairs than if you have, lawyers and you have economists and you have a large team. So I do think that we ultimately will see smaller traders, smaller exporters, smaller businesses probably disproportionately hit. I do think from previous research we did at Export Development Canada that we did see that impact, that larger firms were generally both they trade more in general, but they've been a bit more resilient. So I do think that small businesses and smaller micro firms will be probably disproportionately hit by this, or will not have the same resilience or capacity or lines of credit or other things that they can draw on. So some of the suggestions that we would have for businesses, I think, are just general advice. I think it's, goes without saying, but should be underscored, is what I said before, on really attempting to take a deep breath and not to panic right now, because I have talked to some businesses before in that same region who are saying, well, we have to lay off our staff. And I would say, so which tariff are you concerned about? Like what are your HS codes? Are you aware of the products that you import? Are these going to be affected by tariffs? Is the tariff in place yet? Like, obviously, I think these things matter to assess your company level risk. It's very, very basic, but the way that international trade is adjudicated, there are very specific harmonized systems codes. And in some cases, you could be on the one side where you're completely exempt from this, and another state of the world, you could be dragged in and you could be dealing with a shock. So I think just basically trying to do an inventory and understanding your company level risks is going to be different for every company, but I think that's something that people should obviously be trying to do. Scenario planning is important for any business size. So thinking through, I mentioned our best estimate based on these large macro trade models is that this would, if implemented, this would be a recessionary shock for Canada. And even if not implemented, but threatened for a prolonged period of time, would definitely slow business investment. So I think you should think about states of the world where overall demand for your product, maybe stable this year, but may also in scenario B, C, and D, or plan A, B, C, D, would fall by 10%, by 20%. I think a lot of the areas that we look at from a tariff perspective, the modeling doesn't come out as sort of uniform, but if the price of something increases by 25%, often there's a reduction in demand for those things typically, and it may be in the same ballpark. So thinking about running a stress test on your books from last year's revenue, and then going forward, if we had 75% of the revenue we had last year, what would that do? Would that then require us to have to think about cutting costs and laying folks off? So we talked about other things that I think are relatively practical, and just reviewing where you're sourcing your materials from and whether those would be impacted by tariffs or not. I think in the last rounds of all these things we had, people did look internal and they looked domestic. And if you can buy something down the street, I mean, the other question is, if you could do this before, you probably would have done it. But I think, again, people get into these modes of operation. And so maybe opening your eyes up afresh and looking and saying, well, are there options to buy something in Ontario that I know I have a source of, stable trade flows, and that could reduce my costs. We do know that there'll be changes in the exchange rate, and there's going to be more volatility in the exchange rate. So I'm not sort of really in the weeds on financial markets as much as people that are in those markets and thinking about that. But I think the general advice would be to look at your exposure to currency changes and talk to folks about how would you hedge this exposure. The longer term suggestion people have made on diversifying trade, I think is an important one, and one that Canada has been making progress on through different trade deals, like in the Canada-European trade deal, through CPTPP. There's other places now where Canadian firms have relatively safe and secure duty-free access to lots of different markets. So we should leverage those. And then finally, on the other side, I mentioned just stress testing your books, but also thinking about which is regardless of whatever Donald Trump was doing or whatever state of the world we're in, trying to contain your costs as best as possible is always good housekeeping, and looking for some efficiencies to make some investments to automate processes, or to make your company and operation more resilient, which I think, at any state of the world is just something companies should be looking at. So I think it's sort of common sense things. But what I worry about when we have discussions like this or events like this in the chamber is I do worry. I don't want companies to feel overwhelmed or helpless, or feel like this is something to despair. I think again it lets us think harder about what can we take control over, and what is, if you're a business owner, what are the things that you can do to put yourself in the best position, regardless of what is going to happen of something that you can't control.
I think it's so important in times like this that we actually do run the different models, that we do actually put our business through a stress test, anything that gives us actually a better understanding where we are at. Also, at the same time, I believe when we do this, there's also often new opportunities that come to the horizon we hadn't thought of in beforehand. And on that topic of it, so we on one side looked at it, what are some of the things that SMEs can do? And on the other hand, in our conversation so far today, you have mentioned a few things that actually policy-wise we need to drive forward, that the governments at all levels can do. And one of the questions from one of our participants here today is, are there policy recommendations that the CCC, that all chambers have identified, that would get us easier wins on interprovincial trade, recognizing there is no amount of internal trade that can replace the US states as a trade partner, but it seems to differently impact different sectors. And I was wondering specifically on the Canadian Chamber's position on this one.
Yes, so I'm not our policy lead on this, so I'll just sort of caveat that to say that, so Candace right now, our CEO, is involved in internal trade discussions that are happening, I believe, in even Toronto today. So this is something that's taking place. As I mentioned before, I think people do see this external threat and then looking internal and saying, okay, I don't, as the question acknowledges, it's not necessarily the case that you can fully offset a shock of this level, but you can do the better housekeeping stuff I talked about. So I think on that side, the estimates that I've seen on the economic research, which seem to be relatively compelling, of pretty big potential sand in grits in the wheels that we have right now on the internal market. And we do know that companies that both sell beyond their own provincial borders, but also internationally, these companies are more productive, they invest more, they're more innovative, they make more money. So I think we do think that sort of opening up markets or making the Canadian market more efficient is a good thing. Some of the ways that that could be done is rather than bringing 10 or 13 different partners in Canada together to think about, let's get a common securities regulator as one example, which has been discussed for a long time. The easiest way to do this, I think, in a relatively straightforward and simple way is a mutual recognition path forward, where if something, a good or service or licensing or occupations are viewed as fit for purpose in Ontario, that they would be accepted as fit for purpose in BC. And so if you have your Niagara wine and you want to, and people view this wine as, tastes good and is also safe and should be sold, that allowing that to be sold across provincial borders and taking down some of the monopolies or restrictions that we have across trade. I think a lot of people think that even if there were no tariff threat or even if nothing else was happening, these are things that we could do that would improve the functioning of our economy and improve the business landscape anyway. So we should be doing that. And I think the one benefit that Trump has offered us has been the sense of urgency. And you haven't seen 200 people in a room get excited about internal trade barriers in many years. And we've been talking about this for a while, but I think there is a window of time and policy horizon now that there's pressure, there's focus, there's urgency. And so I do think, and we are starting to see this happen right now, but I think we're going to see more of that in the short term.
And you know what, this is something that we have seen in recent history as well, is that the situation actually asks for some urgent measures and that our governments at all levels actually have stepped up for it. We have seen policies that we have advocated for sometimes for years, all of a sudden overnight actually coming into place. So we hope on more of that. So if interprovincial barriers might be one aspect of it, you had also spoken about untapped international markets. And I was wondering, how can we support businesses, SMEs, and finding out and tapping into some of those opportunities? What is a good way to move forward?
That's a good question. So I used to work at Export Development Canada, and there we were focused obviously on export promotion and export creation. So these are, again, things that we think are important and are helpful regardless, because of the fact I mentioned, I was running the research department there. When you look at the micro level data and compare the firms that are engaged in these activities in trading versus those that aren't, there's both the selection where you just have generally better firms are choosing to these things, but even the competition that you're exposed to when you go outside, let's say the Ontario market, and you're in the Canadian market, and then you're going bigger. It's the same as if you think about your local hockey team. If you start playing in your region, you do well, and you win that tournament. Well, then you go to the provincial, then you national, then you go to the Olympics. I mean, you're going to get better as you go on, and I think we do see that just within companies. And so I think we should be encouraging companies to trade more. I do think that most companies have found the most natural or obvious and easy in many cases, the center of gravity and the look at the map, it's right there. Similar customs, similar business practices. So I think we've seen the majority of our trade for the last, well, since NAFTA, but even before that, the majority of our trade is taking place 3/4 or so on the good side with the United States. That hasn't changed a lot, other than some changes on the margin through the Asian economies and China in particular. And we're not likely to see a trade deal with China, I think, anytime soon, for Canada and India anytime soon. But the other areas in Europe and in the CPTPP kind of ASEAN, Asia Pacific region, we are seeing a lot more liberalization, a lot more interest. So I think those are some markets that are going to be difficult if your main buyer is the US buyer, and 80% of your goods are going to the US. It's going to be very difficult to make up for that. So the first thing that Canadian policymakers should do, as they're obviously doing now, is to focus on maintaining barrier-free access to the US market. But in a state of world where that's going to be impeded even for a short period of time or for a longer period of time, companies do need to look elsewhere. And I think, just like we said on internal trade, we're seeing the same thing outside the borders of, can I both import from different countries where I won't face a tariff if it's not the United States, but can I export to these countries as well? There's a long process, I think, that people have in their business journeys to get from where they're at to be exporting different places, but it's something that I think with concerted effort and with policy supports and with information, because all of these are information problems, building up supplier bases and things over time can definitely help companies both increase their growth, but also make them less dependent upon one particular buyer in one particular market when something like this happens.
Thank you. We've spoken a lot about the impact and the things that SMEs can do. I would also like to take a moment to just look at municipalities. We can look at, and you had mentioned stimulus packages that maybe would come from the provincial or the federal government. Well, what are some of the things that are actually in the purview of also municipalities that they can do to support businesses? So here in Niagara, we at the Chamber have a partnership with along the border with Canadian and US chambers that has helped us bringing really stakeholders and people and businesses together to hopefully leverage and grow that voice. I know that a high number of our local municipally elected officials are on trade missions, are part of the Great Lakes Chamber Coalition and others, really trying to impact it, strengthen the relationships that we have on both sides of the border. But when we specifically look at municipalities and looking at them, depending on the local businesses, we all do at all times. But what are some of the things and measures maybe that municipalities can put in place to support businesses and as we're moving through these uncertain times?
Yeah, well, this is probably a topic that I think you would have a bit more
Yeah.
on the ground insight. So maybe feel free to add on or to go deeper. I think you're right that the first thing, if you're a municipal sort of business improvement agency or area, kind of looking at that, we have recommended. So the chamber network is very strong, and we've got over 400 different chambers across the country, working at the national, the provincial, and working at local levels, and working across the borders. So we have seen an increased desire for the Canadian side to reach out to local stakeholders, because again, what I think what people feel longer term is the business case and the common sense will ultimately prevail in these relationships over time, but that we need to get some of the pressure and be speaking to Americans, and the message is being delivered by, let's say, a local American Chamber of Commerce and American businesses to their local representatives will be as effective, possibly more effective than Canadians coming down and lecturing people about the importance of the relationship. I think we're not viewed, I think, as first and foremost in most Americans' minds when they wake up in the morning. But we do need to reinforce these messages of just the mutual beneficial trade relationship we've had, and the fact that we have a very long partnership. So I think we can try to work closely with the US stakeholders. We are trying to do our best in terms of the data and analytics capacity for the National Chamber for the Business Data Lab. So we're trying, if people have suggestions for statistics or tools or other things, like I said, we developed provincial, state level, and now city level. We're working actually now, one of my economists is working on US cities' impacts of tariffs, because we're trying to, again, make this business case that if tariffs are imposed, it's bad for workers and for business on both sides of the border. And so it's bad for Detroit. It's obviously bad for Windsor, but it's bad for Detroit as well. So we're trying to help with the policy advocacy folks by providing some of that. And then I'm not sure, I would be interested to hear what your thoughts are on municipalities, like bringing people together, having these discussions, knowledge exchanges. But do you have anything that you're thinking would be a course of action that is appropriate?
I think one of the ones that you've mentioned is communication. I think the more data and information that we have, I think the more critical it is to have an understanding, because I think there's a lot that is happening. It's an uncertain time, but there's more than one business that makes a sector. And so when we hear how other people are reacting and responding to it, I think it's critical, because I think there's a significant amount of learning that's going on. I think you're absolutely right. I think we have established this partnership across the border with a number of chambers on both sides. And those conversations are really good. And I think you're right. The message actually coming from a US business versus one of us is heard differently and has a different impact. So that is key. I think there's also a lot of understanding that we feel a lot of pain here, or the Canadian businesses do, but so do US businesses. We hear from these manufacturers saying, like, I can't go down the road and just find someone, to replace the partnership and the trade agreement that I have with these businesses here north of the border. So there's a lot of understanding on that end of it. I still think there's also a lot of trust relationships that are really being amplified and that are growing at this point. And I think that is really good to see at the same time. So I think there's many facets, data-driven communication, partnerships that we have. I think there's a lot of people looking at contracts specifically and assistance on those in those areas of it that helps, and any data around it and evidence that makes a difference. So
But can I just say, like, in response to what you said, that those are the things that give me a lot more of the optimism, a lot more of the hope that if we are in hopefully the worst of it, for now, that if I ask myself whether or not I do believe that there'll be a fundamental North American trade relationship on a preferential basis if Donald Trump is gone in 4 or 5 years, well, the rationale and the reason to believe for that, I think, is just as you said, the strong relationships that we have across the border, and the fact that it makes business sense for businesses to continue to operate by not imposing a 25% cost on something that doesn't need to be there. So you do hope that over the longer term, we're able to maintain the access to the market in the US that we have. And that we can also kind of branch out and work with other markets as well to diversify so that we're less resilient, and less dependent upon one particular market, just in case, things like this happen every once in a while. And we don't want to be, in 10 or 20 years from now, as dependent as we are right now, if possible.
Yeah, and it gives us the opportunity to diversify. Steve, I'm noticing we only have 3 or 4 minutes left, but there's 2 questions that have come back. You had touched on them, but I think it's maybe a good way to look at it. Again, you had touched on the interest rate impact. How might future interest rate announcements influence the impact of US tariffs? And then the other one that had come forward from a couple of attendees to the impact or influence on investment trends that we might see. Are now foreign countries not going to invest in Canada? Is this going to make us less competitive overall? And I know it's 2 parts to a question, but I'm conscious of the time.
I'll be quick. On the invest in Canada, I think, yes, I think we're going to go through a period of time where investment attraction is harder now than it was before Donald Trump was elected. And I think that nothing that anybody says or does in particular is going to change that reality right now, because that's a lot of what Trump's focus is. But I do think Canada still has a lot of things going for it. And I think that we have a very strong labor force. We have a lot of critical minerals and natural endowments that are located here that are important. I think that people will be revising their investment decisions, but a lot of these things, again, I mentioned before the persistence, there's the quote brownfield and then greenfield. Yes, on the margin, I do expect that more greenfield, more startup, more new investments, whether blue skied, will be looking and thinking of going other places. But I do think that a lot of the investments that are in place, I don't expect those to be moving full force, because there's a big stock of things. Canada's invested over $1 trillion in the US economy over the last, built up over the last while. It takes a while. This is not just hot money. These are actual investments in machinery, equipment, and things. It really takes a long time and is slow to rebuild those processes. And especially if you don't need to, if they're working well, you don't need to adjust those things. But yeah, I think the main point of the question is there will be more pressure. And in particular, if you think about a big deregulation effort in the United States and lower corporate income taxes, which are likely coming, then that will require Canada to respond, just as we had to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act that Biden brought in. I think those same dynamics will emerge over time as we get through the trade war. And your first part of the question was on monetary policy. So, like I said, there's different ways to look at it. The Bank of Canada will be dealing with both higher prices and a weaker economy. I do think that they need to be aware of that, and they are. But I think if it's a major shock, I think people could at least understand that monetary policy can only do so much, but it is going to do something, and it would likely reduce interest rates, reduce borrowing costs, try to spur some spending. That would bring the cost of our Canadian dollar and exchange rate down further. And that on its own will cushion some of this. Let's say you have a big change in the cost of trade, but the dollar goes down, that will offset some of those things. So I think there are mechanisms and offsets that people don't necessarily think about and see until they think through. And so, the impacts will be less than advertised because of the way that the economy will adjust in real time to as things roll out.
Stephen, I wanted to really thank you on behalf of all of us here, my team here, our participants in this webinar, for actually sharing your insights and your wealth of knowledge with us today. It is good for us, for all of us in Canada, to have these conversations, so it's really appreciated. I also want to extend my appreciation to Niagara Economic Development for partnering on this session. And to all participants, this is just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the economic situation we're finding ourselves in. Please know that there's a number of more informational sessions and events that are coming up regarding this topic, so please stay tuned. Again, thank you all for joining us, and I'm wishing everyone a great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.